Well, hello and welcome to our next Zoom session in 120 Anatomy. It is now April 2nd, 2019, and we are continuing on in the topic of cochlear or inner ear physiology. So last week, I'll give a little overview of the things we covered last week. I would focus on that horizontal movement of fluid, resulting in the vertical up and down motion of the scala media. And that is essentially that up and down motion is the traveling wave. And last week we talked about how the traveling wave was asymmetrical and how that resulted in what we call the upward spread of masking. Then we covered the twofold role of outer hair cells, namely that they sharpen and they amplify the traveling wave peak. And as a result of all that work that they do, they send off a byproduct, just like sweat is a byproduct of working hard. The byproduct of the outer hair cells action is otoacoustic emissions. And that's where we ended last week. So let's look at some pictures here and get a good grip of where we are. Share screen. And let's look at our notes first. And in our notes, where we were, if we start right at the top, the traveling wave and how it excites the hair cells. Now remember, inner hair cells are afferent, outer hair cells are efferent, okay? Afferent sending information to the brain, efferent taking information from the brain. Good to know this name here. That's the guy that discovered the traveling wave. Gold was a co-worker with him who suspected outer hair cell action in that the outer hair cells amplify the traveling wave and sharpen it. But von Bekesi didn't believe him. Kemp, years later, linked outer hair cells and otoacoustic emissions discoveries, and he proved that Gold was right. There's the horizontal and vertical motions in the cochlea. Looking at PowerPoint slides here to make that clear. Again, here's von Helmholtz, who discovered that the cochlea was tonotopic, that like keys on a piano, specific frequencies are represented in specific places. Von Bekesi, who discovered the traveling wave, won a Nobel Prize for his efforts. And while I'm showing this to you, remember, he made a great big model of the cochlea in his lab at Harvard University. And the model didn't quite work as well as he'd hoped. He thought it would work way better if the footplate of the stapes was put into the round window as opposed to the oval window. His model worked better then. Gold suggested maybe there's some other action that you're not accounting for. The outer hair cells were the action that Gold was suspecting. That's why von Bekesi's little model didn't work as well as he'd hoped. Anyway, another picture of von Bekesi. There's Thomas Gold. There's Thomas Gold in the middle toward the end of his life. And he was, of course, vindicated as being correct in that he suggested the outer hair cells were acting to sharpen and amplify the traveling wave. There is Kemp, the person who validated Gold and by discovering otoacoustic emissions. And OAEs are a byproduct of what the outer hair cells are doing. In other words, if you don't have otoacoustic outer hair cells, you don't have otoacoustic emissions. Here's that horizontal back and forth motion we've talked about over the past couple of weeks. The footplate of the stapes is causing fluid action into the scala vestibuli, which would be the red arrows going around and then down through the helicotrema. Scala tympani, the green arrows, scala tympani, the green arrows pushing against the round window. See where I'm circling? Very important to retain a grasp of this. There's a sideways picture. This is another picture from von Bekesi you've seen before. Okay, the footplate of the stapes pushing in and out of the round in the oval window. Now the buildup of fluid here, because it has to squeeze through that little round point that's the helicotrema, is something has to give due to the pressure of the fluid because it's being squeezed in a smaller area. And that pressure may give way over here, you'll hear a high frequency sound. Over here, a mid frequency sound, and over here, a low frequency sound. A cross section of the cochlea is showing you what's happening when looking at the scala media. So this indentation of the black here is the indentation of Reissner's membrane and basilar membrane of the scala media. Tonotopic cochlea, tonotopic cochlea. There's that horizontal back and forth movement resulting in the vertical up and down movement. And this vertical up and down movement taking place at some unique place along the basilar membrane is called the traveling wave. The traveling wave is what's causing this bending. The peak of the traveling wave is what's causing this bending. So here's the traveling wave. It may indent here or wherever. Again, the traveling wave may stop here, or it may continue on and stop here. Wherever it stops, that's where its peak is the biggest. That's what, because it grows and slows as it goes. Okay? And coming to a complete stop at some unique place along the basilar membrane. Wherever it stops, wherever that peak of the wave is where the hair cells become sheared. Why? Because the scala media becomes bent. So Reissner's membrane and basilar membrane are bent, therefore the entire scala media is bent. And looking at this hinge and this hinge, when you have a two-hinged thing and the whole scala media bends, the hairs get sheared. Okay? Scala media at rest, scala media at the peak of the traveling wave. The bending of the hair cells is what sends an electrical current up the eighth nerve to the brain. This picture is showing you the same thing, only it's highlighting the hinges even more. Okay? So if this would bend, you can see how mechanically the hairs are going to get sheared. Notice that the hairs of the outer hair cells are embedded into the underside of the tectorial membrane, whereas the hairs of the inner hair cells are not. Here's what we talked about regarding the asymmetrical traveling wave last week. It has a steep front and a longer tail, much like the shape of a kite. And we said last week, if you draw the outline of the wave, that's called the envelope. So the high frequency hair cells might be here at the base, lows at the apex, and this would be a high frequency sound, a traveling wave caused by a 2000 hertz tone, a traveling wave caused by a 200 hertz tone. Either way, the traveling wave envelopes are asymmetrical. Same here. Okay? And the reason why the traveling waves would stop here or stop here is because with a high frequency sound, it'll end where the basilar membrane will literally resonate. So basically, this area has less mass and is more stiff. This area has more mass and is less stiff. In other words, if you looked at it here, you can see that. Okay? The scala media gets wider as you move to the apex of the cochlea. So if you follow my cursor, the bony labyrinth might be big and wide at the left side, and the bony labyrinth is quite narrow toward the apex of the cochlea, right? Like a honeycomb, wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. Okay? But exactly the very opposite scene takes place inside the scala media. Shown here where highs would be on the right this time and lows toward the left. Again, a traveling wave caused by a low frequency, a mid frequency, or a high frequency tone. Either way, they're always asymmetrical. And that asymmetrical shape, once again shown here, okay? Always keep that in mind because that explains the upward spread of masking. So when you're looking at saying one word, information, look at how many traveling waves you're getting. Okay? Lots of them, but they're all asymmetrical. If this is the apex and this is the base of the cochlea, the length of this shows what's happening over time. So in low frequency waves, See how the tail is longer, the front is steeper? In soft high frequencies. Formation. All right, asymmetrical waves dictate what's called the upward spread of masking. If you are looking at the orange wave here, you'll see its front is once again steep, the low frequency hair cells here, the tail is longer and more shallow. It's at the peak where these hair cells are stimulated. Okay, and look at how it's dull and round. Nonetheless, we'll get to that next. Focus right now on the asymmetrical shape, because a loud, low-frequency truck rumbling across the street can mask the soft peeping of a canary in your kitchen, but it doesn't work the other way around. The soft rumbling of a truck will not be masked very well by the loud peeping of a hairy canary. Okay, the wave will get taller because the canary has gotten louder, but the front of the wave isn't really activating here, is it? And that's all because of the asymmetrical shapes of the waves. So lows mask highs better than highs mask lows, called the upward spread of masking. Looking at this slide here now, now we leave the upward spread of masking and we're looking at the sharpening of the traveling waves. And this is done by the outer hair cells. So the outer hair cells are literally stretching and shrinking. Here's the outer hair cells. Here's the inner hair cells. Here's the tectorial membrane where the hairs of the outer hair cells are jammed into the underside. If we look here, we've torn away the tectorial membrane. We've ripped this yellow thing off, and you're looking at its underside. And you can see where the hairs of the outer hair cells were literally jammed into it. This is the action. Because the hairs are literally jammed in, the outer hair cells, when they shrink, they pull this tectorial membrane down so that the tectorial membrane can indeed activate the inner hair cells. How do the outer hair cells get this message? That's largely an unknown. We don't really have a good grip on that. Okay, we just don't really have a tight grip on that, but we do know that somehow if sounds are softer than 50 or 60 decibels, if they are softer than that, the outer hair cells kick into work and do what you're seeing on the screen. If the sound activating the cochlea is louder than 50 to 60, then there's enough fluid motion taking place in the scala media to bend the hairs of the inner hair cells. So this mechanical action of the outer hair cells, that's the work done by the cochlea. And that work is what puts off sweat. Okay, and the sweat, in quotes, is otoacoustic emissions. Outer hair cells cause the active cochlea. They are the active cochlear mechanism. Here's von Beckesy's traveling waves. Here's one, okay, caused by a low frequency tone. Remember, all he had was cadavers, and cadavers are dead people, and dead people have dead hair cells. So he couldn't witness and see the action taking place by way of the outer hair cells. That action was not visible to him. So he just assumed this. He assumed that you had, if it was a high frequency sound, it would cause a dull rounded peak over here. If it was a mid frequency sound, it would cause a dull rounded peak over here. A low frequency sound would cause a dull rounded peak toward the apex of the cochlea. Remember, one row of inner hair cells all along, and 3 rows of outers, 4 rows of outers, 5 rows of outers toward the apex, right? Okay, but look at how many frequencies are stimulated at the same time. And when asked, when Gold would say, how can a person tell the difference between frequencies close together? Von Beckesy said, oh, that fine tuning is done further up in the brain. Gold didn't believe that. He believed that the cochlea had an active mechanism that would serve to literally sharpen the peaks of the traveling waves. And this was discounted by von Beckersey, okay? So, but this sharpening, notice there's two things happening. One, the wave got taller, and secondly, the wave got sharper. So now this person can distinguish between frequencies close together. And what's the most common hearing loss in the world? Sensory neural hearing loss, presbycusis, hearing loss in the elderly. And what's that caused by? Death of outer hair cells. Why? Because the outer hair cells are the moving part. And in any system, the moving part goes first. So when you've got outer hair cell damage, you have an inability to hear below 50 to 60. Welcome to presbycusis. And that loss will be mostly in the treble frequencies. Okay, so a mild to moderate hearing loss, usually toward the base of the cochlea. So the hair cell damage will really be mostly over here. There's reasons for that. We'll look at that later. Okay, so outer hair cell contributions to the traveling wave, the twofold role of the outer hair cells, the amplification and the sharpening. And this would explain why hearing aids for ears aren't like glasses for eyes. Okay, imagine two tones close together causing two traveling waves. So you've got two tones that are close in frequency put into the ear, and the traveling wave envelopes look like this in a normal hearing person. Easy to distinguish between the two frequencies, but when you've got outer hair cell damage, you've lost the peaks and the sharpness. So now when you take a hearing aid and put it in someone's ear, yep, you're making the traveling wave bigger, you're amplifying again, but the sharpness is not restored. And that's the kicker with hearing aids. Okay, think about hair cell damage as like Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, had a great fall. All the king's horses and people couldn't put Humpty together again. You can't. Okay, so that's why hearing aids have a twofold role. They need to amplify, but the other thing that hearing aids need to do is they need to increase the signal to noise ratio. What does that mean in English? It needs to increase the amplification for speech compared to the amplification for background noise. Somehow hearing aids have to sort out what's speech and what's noise. And they've got to increase the speech more than the noise. So not only do they have to amplify, but they also have to selectively amplify. They have to increase the signal, the speech that you want to hear compared to the noise. Let's say you're sitting in a cafeteria and the noise is 60 decibels and the speech is 60 decibels. Okay? If that's the case, the noise and the speech are equal in loudness, aren't they? 60 is equal to 60. That's a 0 dB signal to noise ratio. Let's say you're in the cafeteria and the speech is, the noise is 60 and the speech is 50. Well, that's a -10 signal to noise ratio. Let's say you're in the cafeteria and the noise is 60 and the speech is 70. That's a +10 signal to noise ratio. Obviously, the pluses are better than the minuses, okay? So again, hearing aids need to amplify and they need to increase the signal to noise ratio. Reason being, because of the dull, rounded, traveling waves. I can amplify, but this ain't this. So if you make the speech louder than the noise with the hearing aids, guess what? The person with the damaged hair cells, even though the hearing aids are only doing this to the person and not restoring this, if you make the speech louder than the noise, this person on the bottom here can, C-A-N, can separate the signal from the noise. Why? Because you've increased the signal to noise ratio. See? So it's really, there's anatomy is tied in with everything you're going to be doing in clinic. No, you're not going to be telling Mrs. Jones all about this stuff, but as a clinician, you need to understand because this is what separates our field from optometry. Glasses are just fitting conductive vision loss. Light isn't properly reaching the retina or the back of the eye. So you go to the store, you buy glasses to refocus the light upon the retina. Done. That's like having otitis media, okay? Or a chunk of wax blocking your ear. Remember, we always said conductive hearing loss is like a plug in the ear, okay? If you make the sounds louder, God's in his heaven and all's well with the world, because the hair cells of the cochlea are undamaged. So if our field was like optometry, all of our clients would come in with middle ear disorders and outer ear disorders. We wouldn't have inner ear disorders. If you want to make that akin to vision again, have you ever heard of macular degeneration? That is an actual destroying or damaged retina of the eye. Thankfully, it's rather rare, okay? The most common vision loss is conductive. Light isn't being properly conducted to the back of the eye. Always remember, conductive hearing loss is just how sound is conducted through to where it's got to go. And where does it got to go? The cochlea. It's all about the cochlea. The other parts of the ear just serve and worship the cochlea. They're bringing the sound to the cochlea. So keep the big picture in mind, and it'll always help. Back to share screen. So, looking at this situation, otoacoustic emissions are like the ear in reverse. The outer hair cells are working their tails off. Okay, and because they're doing that, now this cochlea is out of a rat or a chinchilla. Okay, do you know why we always pick on rats and chinchilla for research in this field? Because look at their cochleas. It sticks out into space. It's not surrounded by bone. It's actually like a honeycomb with walls around it. And here's the bony labyrinth, and here's the membranous labyrinth. Very easy to look at. You know, you can just burr away the walls, this outer wall here, and you can see what's all inside. Cool. Can't do that with the human cochlea because the whole thing is surrounded by bone. See? Anyway, OAEs are like the ear in reverse. You know how they're measured? Because they're used to test babies who can't answer whether they hear a tone. Okay? Or it's good to test liars who are lying to you about their hearing levels. Okay? Think about it. Here's the probe. It's put into the ear. And you just want to have it block out noise. And what's happening there is here's your inner hair cells, here's your outer hair cells. The inners are sending info to the brainstem. This is just sort of a weird picture of some areas of the brainstem. We'll look at that more in weeks to come, but just call this whole thing the brainstem. And so this is the 8th nerve, and this is that olivocochlear bundle. It's the nerves going from the brainstem to the outer hair cells. See how it's a two-way street? So the outer hair cell action, what they're doing, gives rise to otoacoustic emissions. The probe is stuck in the ear canal. 2 tones are spit out into the ear canal. And they go through the middle ear, activating the cochlea, and the work of the outer hair cell stretching and shrinking produces backward traveling wave, going back, that hits the oval window, wiggles the middle ear ossicles, and now the eardrum is acting like a speaker. And that little tone is picked up by the mic. So that probe has 3 holes in it. One for one frequency, one for another frequency that's close together, and the third one picks up an otoacoustic emission. It's not the 2 tones bouncing back. Here's another picture of it. They call it distortion product, I wish that thing would go away. That thing hanging on the top, it always bugs me. Distortion product otoacoustic emissions. Okay, pair of pure tones of different frequencies, F1, F2, present them simultaneously through the probe and measure the returning OAE that bounces back or that comes out. So here's the speaker, here's the probe, got 3 holes in it, it's put in the ear canal. Frequency 1 and 2 are sent out, those are the red arrows, going through the ear canal, going through the middle ear, activating the cochlea, and the outer hair cells are producing a distortion product, which goes back out through the ossicular chain, through the ear canal, and is picked up by the mic. Weird, huh? Here's a spectrum of what takes place. 2 tones, F1, F2, and here's your distortion product, otoacoustic emission. If you didn't have outer hair cells, you could put these 2 tones in, but this little guy ain't coming back out. And this is what's produced as the byproduct, or the sweat. Like sweat is a byproduct of work, like heat is a byproduct of a light bulb. Okay, this otoacoustic emission is a byproduct of the work that the outer hair cells are doing to amplify and sharpen the peaks of the traveling waves. Here's another picture. Okay, this would be the noise floor in an ear canal. And look closely at this. It's kind of interesting. So here's frequency along the horizontal, and here's dBSPL along the vertical. See how the noise floor in your ear canal is actually less than 0 dBSPL? Told you 0 dBSPL doesn't mean the absence of sound. 0 dBSPL is simply 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared of pressure. Okay, because that's the softest pressure it took to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. And we elected to call that 0 dBSPL, 0 dB sound pressure level. So but what they do with OAEs is they look at the signal to noise ratio. Was this OAE at least 6 decibels more than the floor? If it was, it's a present otoacoustic emission. Okay, and what they'll do is they'll put the 2 tones around these frequencies, around these frequencies, around these frequencies. In other words, these 2 tones, they have to be split by a certain amount, by a certain ratio. I'll tell you what that is, but you don't need to know this, but they need to be separated by a ratio of 1 to 1.22. So if one frequency is 1,000, the other frequency's got to be 1,220. If one frequency is 2,000, the other one's got to be 2,440. Okay, always separated by a ratio of 1 to 1.22. And if they move pairs of tones like as they move those pairs of tones higher, higher, higher up in frequency, they keep trying to track if an otoacoustic emission comes from that pair of tones. So this pair of tones here produces this OAEs. Another pair of tones over here where my cursor is would produce an OAE over here. Another pair of tones around where my cursor is, whoops, would produce an OAE that a little bit to the left of it. Here's a picture of me, my hearing some years ago, okay? And here's my hearing level. Here's the noise floor in my ear canal. They always did it twice. The red is the right ear, the blue is the left ear, and it's telling me how much my otoacoustic emissions were above the noise floor. So the red indicates, yep, it's at least 6 decibels higher than the green. So pairs of tones were put in around here, and an OAE came out. Pair of tones around here, this OAE came out. Pair of tones here, this OAE came out, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? And then at the very, very high frequencies, all of a sudden, thunk, it dropped. Look at this. My hearing drops a little bit. See? Isn't that wild? Anyway, let's look at our notes before we do anything else. Make sure we're covering things correctly. So we talked about the horizontal and the vertical motion taking place in the cochlea. We talked about traveling waves versus sound waves last week. Remember, traveling waves aren't sound waves, and sound does not, repeat, not enter a cochlea. So make sure you read that section carefully. We talked about the asymmetrical traveling wave envelope and the implications for the upward spread of masking. We talked about the shearing action of the stereocilia, seen close up. And this section here, I said last week, don't worry about it. The only reason it's in there is to describe, I'll make it real quick, is to describe why doesn't this area stimulate hair cells. You know, so when you've got a traveling wave, see if I can draw it here. Here, why doesn't this stimulate any hair cells? Why is it just here? How come this doesn't stimulate hair cells? That's all that little paragraph in the notes refers to. Okay? It makes sure that the way your nervous system works is at the peak of the traveling wave, that's the hair cells that excite the eighth nerve at those frequencies. At smaller peaks of the traveling wave behind the main peak, the hair cells become more negative in electrical charge, which inhibits the eighth nerve. It explains why the smaller peaks do not activate the hair cells. Don't worry about that. Next. Whoa, that's kind of bounced around. Okay. Then we talked about the twofold role of the outer hair cells, afferent, efferent, and what they do, how outer hair cells are somehow given the message to stretch or shorten. Anyway, von Beckersee, there's gold again. And then we say outer hair cells are the active cochlear mechanism. Yep, you betcha. And most sensory neural loss, e.g. presbycusis, hearing loss in the elderly, is caused by outer hair cell damage. So is noise-induced hearing loss, outer hair cell damage. Inner hair cells tend to be protected and last longer. Now we're looking at our notes further, otoacoustic emissions, outer hair cells and otoacoustic emissions. Basically, they are a non-behavioral test of outer hair cell function. The person doesn't have to respond or reply in any form. That's why they are very useful on infants. For specific two tones are put into the ear, a third one comes back out. They are distortion products. They illustrate that the cochlea is an amplifier. All amplifiers distort. And the amplifiers of the cochlea are the outer hair cells. They amplify 0 to 50 dB by stretching and shrinking and pulling down the tectorial membrane so that the hairs of the inner hair cells can be bent. Literally, in that way, they serve as amplifiers. They make the cochlea what's called nonlinear. In other words, compression. Circle that word, because today's hearing aids all have compression. And compression is such a big, hairy deal that, here I'll stop sharing, you'll be reading this book next year called Compression for Clinicians by yours truly, because hearing aids all use compression. And compression in one sentence means hearing aids amplify soft sounds by a lot and loud sounds by little or nothing at all. Okay, why is that? That is because, that's because of this picture here. Not there. We'll move to here. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Almost there, almost there. Here. Let's make this guy bigger. Look at the red and look at the light blue lines. Now look at the axes. The horizontal represents decibels. Okay, it could be dBSPL, could be dBHL. You've taken 110. We'll look more at that later on this evening in 110 Zoom session, because I had to move that Zoom session from this morning because I had a dental appointment. So 110 is going to be offered at, I believe, 7:30 Central Time, 5:30 my time. So we'll be talking more about dBHL and stuff there. But call these just for now, just call them decibels. And look at the vertical axis. Your perceptions. You could call the horizontal acoustics, and you could call the vertical psychoacoustics. Okay? So to a normal hearing person, look at the red line. 10 dB is soft. To a normal hearing person, so is 20. To a normal hearing person, 50 to 60 sounds, follow my cursor, comfortable. And to a normal hearing person, 100 decibels sounds too loud. Now let's look at hearing loss. Presbycusis, outer hair cell damage, giving rise to mild to moderate sensory neural loss. Now this person can't hear sounds softer than 50 to 60 because of outer hair cell damage. And look at this, 50 to 60 now sounds very soft. You're looking at the light blue line, and yet 100 sounds too loud, just like normal hearing. See how the red and the blue lines meet? And where they meet, that's called recruitment. Recruitment. R-E-C-R-U-I-T-M-E-N-T, recruitment. It just means that the ceiling of loudness tolerance is the same for normal hearing as it is for people with mild to moderate sensory neural loss. The ceiling and the floor. Hearing loss, this is the ceiling. With hearing loss, your floor goes up. Your ability to hear soft sounds diminishes, but your loudness tolerance ceiling doesn't change. So if hearing aids if sounds are coming in from the bottom of the screen, and your hearing is here where my pen is, okay? So if this is your ceiling and your thresholds are, say, 50, okay, and the bottom here is 0, if a 0 decibel sound comes in, I've got to lift it up by 50. Right? So you can hear it. But if a 50 decibel sound comes in, I can't lift that up by 50 because it'll be too loud. I've got to lift it up by less. And if a loud sound comes in, you don't want to amplify it at all. And that's what was shown to you in this picture here. Okay, look at the black arrows. Hearing aids need to amplify soft sounds by a lot, but loud sounds by little or nothing at all. So that gives one reason as to why hearing aids are so expensive. They are like little amplifiers that change the amount by which they're amplifying instantly. If I'm speaking really softly, the amplification increases. And if I start to raise up my line, the amplification automatically diminishes. So they're like amplifiers that are changing the volume control constantly. Why? Because with sensory neural hearing loss, the dynamic range is smaller. Notice I didn't squeeze both hands together. The dynamic range, the floor went up while the ceiling did not. Conductive hearing loss isn't like that. If this is the floor and this is the ceiling, conductive hearing loss just lifts the whole thing up. Okay? Because conductive hearing loss is a plug in the ear. And if you got a plug in your ear, all you want more is power, power, wonder working power, okay? And you want to amplify soft sounds by the same amount as you'd amplify loud sounds. You've just got a plug in your ear, okay? Sensory neural loss means you have no problem with the outer ear, the eardrum and the ossicles. Everything's working cookie smoky. Everything's perfect. The hair cells are damaged. No problem with sound getting to the cochlea at all. No mechanical blockage. Rather, you have death mostly to outer hair cells. Outers tend to die before inners. And that's why if you have a severe hearing loss, let's say it takes 80 decibels for you to just barely hear a sound instead of 50 to 60, that means you necessarily have damage to inner hair cells as well, because outer hair cell death only causes a 50 to 60 decibel hearing loss. If you have an 80 decibel hearing loss, if you need 80 decibels to hear a 1000 hertz tone, you not only have the outer hair cell damage, you also have inner. And if you've got inner hair cell damage, you have really a lot of trouble distinguishing what someone said, because inner hair cells are afferent. So a speech is sent into your ear, a garbled message is being sent to the brain. It's not just that the hair cell, that the traveling waves are dull and rounded because of the outer hair cells lacking. It's not that. It's more than that. That's happened, but in addition, a garbled message is being sent to the brain. So those people have a lot of trouble understanding speech. When they can't lip read, or if they're not using closed captioning on their TV, or when they're talking on a telephone, they have a lot of trouble. If they don't know the context of what's being said, they've got a lot more trouble than you and me hearing what you said. Share screen. Just make sure we're good to go here. Look at we'll get out of this one here. Where are we? And here you can look at it again. And this kind of ties in with 110 acoustics that we're going to be looking at this evening, okay? Look at this carefully. You got hearing loss going down. Call this presbycusis. Good hearing in the low frequencies, moderate hearing loss in the high frequencies, okay? Very typical. This is typical presbycusis, trouble hearing treble. If you look at, this is in dBHL, the audiogram, dB hearing level. Now you're looking at the right. And let's look at the right-hand side and look at the bottom blue line. That's MAP, the softest it took to hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone. So these decibels here are dB sound pressure level. These decibels here are dB hearing level. And remember what we said last week in 110. MAP, the softest it takes to hear all the different tones with one ear under a headphone. Look at how uneven that is. So it takes fewest at around 2,000 to 3,000 hertz. It takes more at 100 hertz or 125. And once again, it takes a little bit more in the very high frequencies. So you've got that curve. This curve is capital I, capital S, bold-faced, underline, dark, and any way emphasize, is 0 dBHL. These differences in dBSPL are built into the audiometer so that really 0 at 1,000 hertz is actually about 5. At 2,000 hertz, it's actually about 2. Okay? At 500 hertz, it's actually about 7. At 250 hertz, it's about, 35. Okay? But look at the red lines. And they are indicating how the floor got higher, but the ceiling of loudness tolerance didn't change. Notice that the curves flatten out too. And we'll look more at that in 110 this evening as well. So, but just we're tying a couple of courses together here because they are tied together. So now you're looking at what's taking place in a dead chinchilla with no outer hair cells working. The inner hair cells can't be activated at all until the input's about 60. Okay, a live rodent or whatever, as soon as you put in about 10 dB, there's action taking place. Okay, so it shows you the outer hair cells are at work in the living animal and not in the dead. Again, this is a peak of a passive traveling wave. Here's the peak of a sharpened traveling wave caused by the outer hair cells. Typical presbycusis is mostly in the high frequencies. Look at how the X's and O's hover around 50 to 60 over here in the highs. So the damage to the outer hair cells is mostly in the high frequencies. Why isn't it so much in the lows? Let's stop sharing and talk. You know why? Think of the carpet by the doorway. Everybody goes through a doorway in order to get into the room. So the carpet by the door tends to be the dirtiest. That's an analogy you can use. And what's the doorway into the cochlea? The base. That's where the footplate of the stapes is, in the oval window at the base of the cochlea. So all activation traveling waves begin at the base of the cochlea. They may begin at the base and stay near the base, or they begin at the base and stop at the middle, or they begin at the base and stop at the highs, at the apex. But by gum, they're always going through the base. The traveling waves are always going through the base. So those hair cells you can think of like the carpet by the door that gets dirty first. That's the best analogy I can give. So now you have a reason for why the treble hearing loss, and B, why the degree. And the degree of loss, around 50 to 60, is because the damage is to the outer hair cells. And outers are the ones that help the inners pick up sounds below 50 to 60. Good. Tying it together. All right, let's look at our notes as well and see where we are. Over here. So, The cochlea, the very fact that hearing aids have to amplify soft sounds by a lot and loud sounds by little or nothing at all. That picture is best seen here. Okay, even here. If I have a soft sound here, I got to lift it up to here. But if I have a sound here, I can't lift it up by the full amount. It's going to be too loud. You can even see it here. What's 100? That's getting to be too loud. Okay? If a soft sound comes in here, I can amplify that by the whole degree of the loss and put it here. But if a sound comes here, I can't amplify by the same amount. I'll blast them through the ceiling. There you go. Important. There you go. Cochlear disorders, you'll cover more of that in 125 this summer. It's a short course. It's only 8 weeks, but it's hearing disorders. But just as a heads up, the main pathology of the cochlea is presbycusis. Cochlear pathology always results in sensorineural hearing loss. You can't fix it. And I always say presby sounds like Presbyterian. Well, Presbyterian means Church of the Elders. Okay? Presbyopia hits you when you're 40. You can't see close up anymore. That's why I wear reading glasses. I can see far, no problem. I just can't see close. That's called presbyopia. Presbycusis hits you when you're 65. You lose treble hearing. You've got trouble hearing treble. Your outer hair cells are damaged, mostly near the base of the cochlea. Presbycusis is hair cell damage due to aging. There's the write-up. Now, this is kind of a thing to note, too. You've got various types of presbycusis, all classified by a guy named Schucknecht, who examined people who had died, and he looked at their audiograms, and then he looked in their cochleas. And he found most mild to moderate sensorineural hearing loss that looked like this picture here, or looked like this picture here. He called that sensory presbycusis. Mild to moderate hearing loss, pretty good speech discrimination, pretty good hearing for speech, associated with outer hair cell damage, by far the most common. Then he found neural. It was often more severe. They had poor speech discrimination abilities, and it was associated with inner hair cell damage. Recall, outer hair cell damage usually, but not always, but usually precedes inner. They found a flatter hearing loss. Mild to moderate again, but flat. Strial presbycusis, the stria vascularis, the blood supply to the cochlea, is compromised. And it results in lack of oxygen to the hair cells all along the cochlea, which is why the hearing loss is similar across the frequencies. And then he found a fourth type. He called it mechanical. It's if the person didn't fit into the above 3 categories. Maybe the basilar membrane got calcified and really wouldn't ripple very well. Mechanical presbycusis. Anyway, think of the word sensory, okay, is mainly outer hair cell damage. Neural is mainly inner hair cell damage. Sensory neural hearing loss refers to hair cell damage. But technically, when you break down the word, sensory is really more looking at outer hair cell pathology. Neural tends to really more look at inner hair cell pathology. But this does a piece of interest to you. Presbycusis and gender effects. In men, men tend to have better hearing than elderly women in the low frequencies, but poorer hearing than elderly women in the high frequencies, because men have usually been more susceptible or working in noisier places. Not always, but usually. Older men, in our past sexist era, the women didn't work much, the men did, worked in the factory or whatever, had more noise exposure. So men had kind of more of a combination of presbycusis and noise-induced loss, whereas women tended to have more of a flatter hearing loss because women are more susceptible to strial presbycusis. So elderly women tend to have slightly poorer hearing than elderly men in the lows, but better high-frequency hearing than elderly men. If you're looking at noise-induced hearing loss, that's the second most common cause of hearing loss. The second most. Okay? And the second most common cause of sensorineural hearing loss is going to look like this. Noise-induced hearing loss. Look at the shape. It's like someone came in your room at night and took a bite out of your hearing. Okay? Just took a piece of 4,000 hertz. And then the hearing gets better again at 8. Now, you know why that's the case? The reason why that's the case is because of the outer ear canal resonance that you studied way back over a month ago. The outer ear canal resonance. It has a peak resonance around 2,700 hertz. It begins to resonate around 15, and it stops resonating around 4. Remember that? And the purpose is to help you hear the high frequency consonants of speech. Remember we said like a wine glass at Christmas, it resonates with the highs. That's why your outer ear has the shape it does, and that's why the length of your canal is the length of your canal. It's a quarter wave resonator. Remember all that stuff? That's the cause of the shape of noise-induced loss. Pretty weird, huh? So basically, they call it often the half-octave shift. Noise tends to damage hair cells about a half an octave higher than the peak of the outer ear canal resonance. So if you move this resonance here, shift it a little bit to the right and flip it upside down, you got this. That's why I drew the outer ear canal resonance on top of the audiogram, indicating that if you're looking at an audiogram, and you're looking at the outer ear canal resonance laid on top of it just for illustration-wise, it helps to explain the shape of noise-induced hearing loss. The very fact that the resonance ends around here is the reason why the hearing loss gets better at the very highs as well. The unique shape of noise-induced hearing loss is the giveaway of a hunter. Okay? Noise-induced hearing loss doesn't look like presbycusis. Presbycusis is mild sloping. Noise-induced has a precipice. There's a precipitous drop past 2,000 hertz. They can hear all these frequencies good, really well. They just can't hear the highs. And these are the hardest people to fit with hearing aids. Why? Because they can hear pretty well without the hearing aids. Look at all these frequencies that are perfectly normal. It's just these. They are going to complain about hearing in noise. They can hear perfectly well one-on-one. Okay? They'll have trouble hearing in background noise, and that's exactly the most challenging listening situation for hearing aids. Hearing aids have their hardest time in background noise. That's why I always call noise-induced hearing loss people the hardest people to fit. Here's hair cell count in a person who died who had noise-induced hearing loss. And you can see the inners and the outers. These are the outers represent, and all along the basilar membrane, the damage is in the high frequencies. You can see that, okay? The number of hair cells remaining. Good, 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 thunk. Here is a right-handed hunter. Now, when you're shooting a rifle, as you know, since I'm talking to Americans here, if I'm right-handed, I'm holding the rifle like this. So which ear is getting most of the sound? My left ear. If I'm left-handed, I'm holding the rifle like this. Which ear is getting most of the sound? My right ear. Okay? You can tell in what handedness someone is if they have asymmetrical noise-induced loss. May have it more in one ear than the other ear. In other words, in one ear, I'll show it to you. In one ear, the noise-induced hearing loss might look like in the right ear, but in the left ear, it might be way worse. That can happen. Maybe you're a trucker. You're driving a truck and you got the window beside the driver's seat. That's mostly open. That's getting more of the noise of the truck. Okay? So your noise-induced hearing loss doesn't have to be symmetrical. It can be very different. In this case, it is pretty similar between ears. Okay? Just like presbycusis is quite similar between ears. Noise-induced hearing loss doesn't necessarily have to be similar to both ears. It happens to be here and here. Okay? So in a hunter here, the person may have had less hair cell damage to his right ear and more hair cell damage to his left ear. He was a right-handed rifle shooter. There you go. Meniere's disease is also a pathology of the cochlea. And this one is caused by too much endolymph fluid in the scala media. Too much endolymph fluid. We don't know what causes it. It's almost like an allergy, and it's episodic. The person can feel the aura happening. And three things happen. Hearing loss, rotary vertigo, like when you're throwing up, and the third one, roaring tinnitus. Head noise. Usually hits one ear more than the other ear. And it comes every couple of weeks. It's called Meniere's disease. And your scala media is like this. Too much endolymph fluid inside the scala media. If we share a screen and see what the hearing loss looks like, it rises. It's worse in the lows and gets better in the highs. And this person might have Meniere's in his right ear because the O's represent the right ear. Normal hearing in the left ear. And if you look at why that's the case, if you unrolled the cochlea, and again, I'm laying it across the top of the audiogram on purpose just to illustrate here. At the base of the cochlea, the high frequencies, the basilar membrane, this orange floor upon which the hair cells stand, is narrower and more stiff. Whereas at the apex of the cochlea, it's wider and less stiff, more mass. Remember, you got one row of inner hair cells all along. You might have 3 rows of outer hair cells here, 4 over here, 5 over here. Well, if the walls are not very stiff near the base, it just has more mass, but the walls aren't as stiff. In other words, the basilar membrane, Reissner's membrane, if they're less stiff, if I blow extra fluid pressure, where are the walls going to bulge most? At the base of the cochlea. Because the basilar membrane and Reissner's membrane has less stiffness. Okay? It's all about mass and stiffness, so the loss will be greater in the lows and less in the highs. Tinnitus is called ringing in the ear. Tinnitus is also due to hair cell pathology. Tinnitus is kind of hair cell pathology linked as well with the brain itself. The brain is waiting to hear sounds that it isn't getting. And therefore, there's an imbalance between afferent and efferent information going to the brain, from the brain to the brain, ringing in the ear. Medication doesn't fix it. Tinnitus. Tinnitus isn't very loud. All the medicines for it are snake oil. Okay? They're all rubbish. It's a lie. Tinnitus isn't even all that loud, but it's driving the person nuts. Absolutely nuts. Tinnitus may be only about 5 dB greater than the guy's hearing thresholds, and yet it's the annoyance to the tinnitus that's the thing. It's the reaction to the tinnitus. Think about a dripping faucet that you can hear in the kitchen and you're trying to sleep. The dripping faucet may not even be that loud, but how loud or how much are you going to let it bug you? The treatment for tinnitus is usually a little bit of background noise together with a lot of psychological counseling that it's just a nuisance. If you can partially mask the sound a little bit, okay, you'll take the edge off of it. Have a fan or an air conditioner going on in your bedroom at night, or have a noisemaker, a hippy-dippy rainforest sound or whatever, and always have that going. Don't turn it on when you're going to sleep, or you're telling yourself why, or else you're telling yourself why you are doing that. Just have that noise always going on, so that when you're trying to sleep, that noise helps to cover the sound of the ringing in your ear. Tinnitus is ringing in the ear, and it is not an objective sound. Don't mix it up with otoacoustic emissions. OAEs can actually be sound coming out. Tinnitus is purely subjective. Only the person who has it hears it. Okay? A doctor can't put a stethoscope up and listen to the tinnitus. That's about as far as we want to go in inner ear physiology, because now we're starting to drift into inner ear disorders, and that's actually a separate course. I just give you a little bit of a heads up at the end of today. We've covered 3 weeks on the physiology of the cochlea, and we end the physiology of cochlea here. Next week, we will start to move into retrocochlear pathology. We'll start looking at the 8th nerve. We'll slowly wander in there. But the biggest part of this course was the inner ear. Okay, most time and effort is spent on digesting the inner ear. At least 2 weeks we spent in anatomy, 3 more weeks in physiology, but remember to take home horizontal, vertical movement. The traveling wave is not a sound wave. The traveling wave is asymmetrical, resulting in the upward spread of masking, the twofold role of outer hair cells, and how the cochlea is acting like an amplifier with outer hair cells, because outers help the inners pick up soft sounds below 50, and that's what today's hearing aids do. They try to amplify mostly sounds below 50. And if the sound gets louder than 50, the hearing aids start to back off. They're imitating outer hair cells. Today's hearing aids are electronic imitators of what the outer hair cells used to do in that person. That's kind of the best way I can think of just ending this section on the inner ear. And the fact that hearing aids are trying to imitate the outer hair cells by focusing their amplification on soft sounds below 50, that's called compression. And in one sentence, compression means the hearing aid is amplifying soft sounds more than it's amplifying loud sounds. The amplification, degree of amplification changes depending on the loudness of the sound coming into the hearing aid. Compression. All hearing aids use it. You'll be studying that next year in a course called 240. Hearing aid compression and digital features. Anyway, I've spent my hour here. It's time for me to sign off. I'll stop recording and we'll upload this particular Zoom session as today's YouTube onto Canvas. There you go. I'll shine light in my glasses here. There you go. So I'll stop recording now.